Sarah Carter was folding her husband's shirts when the soldiers broke down her front door. And by the time the sun rose fully over their small farm, she would no longer be his wife in the eyes of the law. She would belong to the king. That single sentence, spoken by a captain who did not even look at her while he said it, was enough to end the only life she had ever known. Her husband James dropped the axe he was holding and ran toward her, and what happened in the next 30 seconds would haunt him for the rest of his days. James was struck across the face with the flat of a sword before he reached her. He fell into the dirt of his own front yard, blood filling his mouth, and still he crawled forward. Still he reached for her hand as the soldiers pulled her toward the wagon. Sarah screamed his name until her voice broke. The captain told James that every person, every field, every child, and every wife in the kingdom belonged to the crown, and that resisting the king's claim was a crime punishable by death. James did not care about the law. He only cared that his wife was being taken from him in broad daylight, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. James was left in the dirt with a broken jaw and no wife. For 3 days he did not eat. He walked from village to village, asking anyone who would speak to him what happened to women who were taken under the king's claim, and every answer he received was the same. Nobody knew. Nobody who was taken to the palace ever came back to speak of it. Neighbors warned him to let her go and rebuild his life, that a farmer had no chance against a king, and that his grief would get him killed if he kept asking questions in the wrong places. James ignored every warning. He sold the only 2 things he owned of value, his father's watch and his mother's ring, and used the coin to buy information from anyone willing to sell it. On the 4th night, a man found him instead. He introduced himself only as Daniel, and he said he knew exactly where Sarah had been taken, because the same thing had happened to him 12 years earlier. Daniel had once had a wife of his own. He described the same soldiers, the same wagon, the same silence that followed. He told James that the palace had tunnels beneath it that no map showed, tunnels he had helped dig with his own hands as a prisoner, and that he was the only person alive who could get James inside without being caught. James asked why a stranger would risk his life for someone he had never met. Daniel's answer was simple. He said the king had already taken everything from him once, and he intended to make sure it did not happen to anyone else without a fight. The 2 men traveled for 6 days to reach the capital, avoiding main roads and sleeping in barns that were not their own. Daniel explained that the palace guards did not patrol the tunnels because they did not believe anyone remembered they existed. He had spent years memorizing every turn while working underground on the king's orders, certain that one day the knowledge would be useful. James asked him what kind of person survives 12 years without acting on that knowledge. Daniel did not answer right away. When he finally spoke, he said that revenge was easy to want and almost impossible to plan correctly, and that he had waited this long because he needed a reason strong enough to risk everything. James's face, and the desperation in it, had convinced him this was that reason. They entered the tunnels on a moonless night, through a collapsed drainage grate, behind an old grain mill. The air underground was thick and difficult to breathe, and every sound echoed further than it should have. Daniel moved without hesitation, counting turns under his breath, while James stayed close enough to touch the back of his coat. At one junction, they heard boots above them and froze in place for nearly 10 minutes without moving a muscle, both men certain that a single mistake would end everything before it began. When the footsteps finally faded, Daniel whispered that they were close to the lower holding chambers, the same place every taken wife and daughter passed through before being sorted for the king's household. What they found in the lower chambers was worse than James had imagined. Rows of cells lined a corridor lit by torches that never seemed to go out, each cell holding a woman who had once belonged to a family somewhere in the kingdom. Daniel explained quietly that most of them would never be seen again, either kept for labor in the palace or sold further along a chain of officials who profited from the king's claim. James searched every face for Sarah's and did not find her, which Daniel said was actually a good sign. It meant she had already been moved upward, likely because someone in the palace had taken a specific interest in her. which was unusual enough to be dangerous. They climbed for nearly an hour through narrow service passages meant for servants who cleaned the upper halls before dawn. Daniel warned James that the closer they got to the royal wing, the fewer places there would be to hide if they were spotted. James asked him again, more urgently this time, why the king would take a particular interest in a farmer's wife with no name and no title. Daniel admitted he did not know for certain, but he had a theory. He said the king had never once, in all the years Daniel had lived in that palace as a prisoner, taken a wife without a specific and private reason, and that reason was almost always tied to something the king wanted buried. They found Sarah in a chamber near the top of the eastern tower, guarded by only 2 men because the king believed no one would ever make it that far. She was alive, and she was unharmed, but she was not behaving the way James expected. She did not cry out with relief when she saw him. Instead, she stared at him with something closer to confusion, as though she were trying to remember a dream she had already forgotten. James called her name 3 times before she responded, and when she finally spoke, she asked him a question that stopped him cold. She asked him why the mark on her wrist, a small, pale scar she had carried since childhood and never understood, had begun to burn the moment she stepped inside these walls. Daniel went pale when he heard her describe it. He asked to see the mark, and when Sarah showed him, his hands began to shake in a way James had not seen from him during the entire journey through the tunnels. Daniel said the mark belonged to a bloodline that the king had spent 20 years trying to erase from every record in the kingdom, a bloodline that, if it still existed, had the sole legal right to challenge his crown. James asked what that meant for Sarah. Daniel's answer came slowly, as though he were still working out the truth himself. He said it meant Sarah was never taken by accident, and that her escape from her own village, and even James finding her, may have been allowed to happen on purpose. Before either man could act on what they had just learned, the door to the chamber opened, and the king himself stepped inside, flanked by 4 guards who blocked every exit. He did not look surprised to see them. He looked, if anything, like a man who had been waiting patiently for a meeting he had arranged a long time ago. He told James to stand down, and then he turned to Sarah with an expression that was almost gentle, almost sad, and told her that the scar on her wrist was not a birthmark at all. It was a brand placed on her the day she was born, the same day he had ordered her taken from the arms of the only woman who ever truly had the right to call herself queen. The king explained, calmly and without a hint of shame, that 21 years earlier he had married a woman the kingdom's council refused to accept, a woman whose bloodline threatened the legitimacy of his own rule. When she gave birth to a daughter, he made a choice he said he had never regretted until this moment. He had the infant taken to a farming family several days from the capital, believing the girl would live an ordinary life and die without ever knowing what she had been born to. He admitted that watching Sarah grow up through reports from distant informants, never once approaching her, had been the hardest discipline he had ever practiced as a king. Sarah asked him, her voice shaking, why he had chosen now, after 21 years of silence, to take her from her home and destroy the only life she had ever known. The king's answer was the kind of confession that changes everything a person believes about their own history. He said the kingdom's council had recently uncovered proof of her bloodline through an old physician's records he thought had been destroyed decades earlier, and that they intended to use that proof to remove him from the throne entirely, replacing him with a distant cousin who had no true claim at all. Taking her by force was never meant to punish her. It was meant to bring her inside the palace walls before the council could reach her first and use her as a weapon against him. James stepped forward despite the guards surrounding him and asked the king directly what he intended to do with her, now that the truth was out in the open. The king said something none of them expected. He said he had no intention of keeping Sarah as a prisoner or using her as a political tool, the way the council wished to. He said he intended to publicly acknowledge her as his daughter and the rightful heir to the throne, a decision that would strip away his own authority, but protect the one person he said he had failed for 2 decades. Daniel, still standing near the door, asked the king why he would give up everything he had built his entire reign protecting. The king turned to Daniel and studied his face for a long moment before answering. He said he recognized the mark on Daniel's forearm from years earlier, a mark given only to prisoners who worked the deepest tunnels beneath the palace, and admitted that Daniel's imprisonment had been one of the injustices he most regretted from his early years on the throne. He said that watching two men risk everything, a farmer for his wife and a former prisoner for a stranger's cause, had reminded him what kind of ruler he had promised to be, before fear of losing power changed him. It was, he admitted, the first time in years he had felt something close to shame instead of control. By the time the sun rose over the capital the next morning, word had already begun to spread through the palace staff that the king intended to make an announcement unlike any the kingdom had heard in a generation. Sarah stood at a window overlooking the courtyard, where soldiers had once dragged her from her home, trying to reconcile the woman she used to be with the truth she now carried inside her. James stayed close beside her, unwilling to let go of her hand even for a moment, still uncertain what any of this meant for the life they had built together as ordinary people. Daniel remained near the door, no longer a prisoner, no longer a stranger, but a man who had finally found the reason he had been waiting 12 years to act on. What none of them yet knew was that the council who had uncovered Sarah's bloodline had already sent word to a rival house 3 kingdoms away, a house that had been waiting decades for exactly this kind of opportunity to seize a throne without ever lifting a sword themselves. The rival house was led by a man named Richard Holloway, a distant cousin of the king who had spent most of his life believing he had been cheated out of a crown that should have passed through his side of the family generations earlier. When his informants inside the council delivered word that a legitimate heir had surfaced, a farmer's wife with royal blood in her veins, Richard understood immediately that this changed everything. If the king acknowledged Sarah publicly, any claim Richard had ever quietly nursed would be finished for good. If, on the other hand, something happened to Sarah before that announcement could be made, the council would have no choice but to turn to him as the only remaining option with a legitimate bloodline. He began preparing his men to ride for the capital before the messenger had even finished delivering the news. Inside the palace, the king called an emergency meeting of his personal guard, men he trusted more than the council itself, and ordered them to move Sarah and James to a secured wing of the palace under constant watch. He explained to Sarah, as gently as he could manage, that the danger she now faced was worse than anything the soldiers who took her from her farm had represented. Soldiers acting on his orders had, in their own way, been trying to protect a secret. A rival house acting out of ambition would not hesitate to end her life the moment it became convenient, and would likely try to frame the act as an accident or an illness rather than risk open conflict with the crown. Sarah asked how anyone could plan to kill a person they had never even met. The king had no comforting answer for her. James refused to be separated from Sarah even for questions of palace security, and Daniel stayed close as well, insisting that a man who had spent 12 years learning every hidden passage beneath the palace was more useful protecting her than standing outside a locked door. The king, to the surprise of his own guards, agreed. He told Daniel plainly that he trusted a man who had every reason to hate him and still chose to help a stranger more than he trusted council members who smiled at him every morning while planning his downfall behind closed doors. It was, Daniel later admitted to James in a quiet hallway, the strangest compliment he had ever received in his life, and one he was not entirely sure he wanted to accept from the very man who had imprisoned him. 3 days later, Richard Holloway arrived at the Capitol gates under the pretense of a routine diplomatic visit, bringing with him 20 armed men disguised as an honor guard. The king's spies had already warned him of the true size and purpose of the convoy, but he chose to let Richard inside the walls rather than risk an open confrontation that would alarm the kingdom before Sarah's identity had been formally announced. He wanted the truth to reach his people on his own terms, not as a rumor spread by a rival desperate to seize power through chaos. Sarah watched from a high window as Richard's men filed into the courtyard below, and for the first time since the soldiers had broken down her front door, she understood that surviving the palace itself might not be the hardest part of what was still ahead of her. That night, The king moved the date of his public announcement forward by 2 full weeks, refusing to give Richard Holloway enough time to organize whatever plan he had traveled to the capital to carry out. Guards were doubled along every corridor leading to Sarah's chamber, and Daniel personally sealed 2 of the old tunnel entrances he knew Richard's men might have already discovered through their own informants inside the palace staff. James stayed awake at Sarah's side through the night, watching the door, unwilling to let exhaustion put her at risk even for a single hour. Sarah, for her part, found herself thinking less about the danger surrounding her and more about the mother she had never known, a woman whose only crime had been marrying a king the council refused to accept. On the second night of waiting, a young guard named Thomas Weller slipped a folded note beneath the door of Sarah's chamber before continuing his rounds as though nothing had happened. James found it first and nearly did not show it to her, certain it was a trap meant to lure them into a hallway where Richard's men could finish what the council had started. Daniel unfolded the note carefully and read it twice before speaking. It was not a trap. It was a warning, written by a guard who had served the palace for 11 years and could no longer stay silent about what he had overheard 2 nights earlier in the eastern stables, where 3 of Richard Holloway's men had been discussing a plan to poison Sarah's evening meal before the announcement could take place. Daniel recognized the guard's name from years earlier, back when he himself had still been a prisoner working the tunnels beneath the palace. Thomas had been the only guard who ever slipped him extra bread during the coldest winters, a small kindness Daniel had never forgotten, even after everything else about that period of his life had turned to bitterness. He told James they could trust the warning, though trusting it and knowing what to do with it were 2 very different problems. If they confronted Richard directly without proof, the council would accuse the king of provoking a diplomatic incident based on nothing but rumor. If they said nothing and the poisoning attempt succeeded, there would be no second chance to correct the mistake. The king chose a third option neither James nor Daniel had considered. He ordered that Sarah's meals be prepared in full view of Richard's own household staff, forcing them to either abandon the poisoning plan or risk being caught in the act by their own allies. He also quietly reassigned Thomas Weller away from the stables and into Sarah's personal guard rotation, a reward the young man had not asked for, but accepted without hesitation. Richard, sensing that his first attempt had been discovered before it could even begin, grew visibly more agitated during the daily council sessions, snapping at advisors and demanding updates on the announcement date that no one seemed willing to give him directly. Daniel used the days of tension to tell James something he had never spoken about since the night they first met on the road outside James's village. He explained that his own wife, taken from him 12 years earlier under the same law that had claimed Sarah, had not survived her time in the palace. She had died within the first year, not from cruelty exactly, but from the slow grief of losing everything she had once known, a grief Daniel said he recognized now in Sarah's eyes every time she looked out the window toward the distant fields beyond the capital. He told James that helping them had never really been about revenge the way he first claimed. It had become, somewhere along the journey through the tunnels, an attempt to save the one thing he had failed to save the first time. James asked Daniel why he had never told him this earlier, during the long nights traveling toward the capital, or the hours spent hiding in the tunnels beneath the palace. Daniel admitted that grief was easier to carry when no one else knew its exact shape, and that saying it out loud made it real, in a way silence never had. Sarah, who had been listening quietly from across the room, walked over and told Daniel that her mother's death and the 21 years of separation that followed had taught her something similar. Grief only became bearable once someone else agreed to carry a piece of it alongside you. It was the first time since arriving at the palace that the 3 of them sat together without discussing danger or strategy, simply existing as people who had each lost something and found, unexpectedly, one another. The morning of the announcement arrived under a sky heavy with clouds that never quite broke into rain. Word had already spread through the capital that the king intended to address the kingdom from the main courtyard steps, and by mid-morning thousands of people had gathered behind the palace gates, uncertain what kind of news would justify summoning an entire city on such short notice. Richard Holloway stood near the front of the assembled nobles with his honor guard positioned strategically throughout the crowd, close enough to reach the steps quickly if the moment called for it. Sarah stood just inside the palace doors, dressed in clothing far finer than anything she had ever worn on the farm, her hands trembling despite James holding one of them tightly at her side. The king stepped onto the courtyard steps first, raising a hand to quiet the murmuring crowd before he began to speak. He told the kingdom, without hesitation or softened language, that 21 years earlier, he had fathered a daughter with a woman the council had refused to recognize as queen, and that fearing for the infant's safety, he had made the decision to send her away, to be raised by a farming family far from the capital. He admitted this had been a failure of courage rather than an act of protection, and that recent events had forced him to correct a mistake he should have corrected decades earlier. As he spoke, he gestured toward the palace doors, and Sarah stepped forward into the open air of the courtyard for the first time since arriving at the capital. The crowd's reaction was immediate and impossible to predict from a single voice within it. Some nobles gasped audibly, others whispered urgently to those standing beside them, and somewhere near the back a woman began to weep, though whether from joy or fear, no one could say for certain. Richard Holloway's face remained still, but James, watching closely from the doorway, saw his hand drift toward his own guards in a signal meant to look casual to anyone not paying close attention. Daniel saw it too, and without waiting for permission, he moved through the crowd toward Richard's position, drawing the attention of two palace guards who followed, without needing to be told why. Richard, realizing his window to act had narrowed to almost nothing, shouted above the crowd that the woman on the steps was an imposter, a farmer's wife dressed up to steal a throne that rightfully belonged to bloodlines the council could actually verify through generations of proper record-keeping. It was a desperate accusation, thin enough that most of the assembled nobles exchanged uncertain glances rather than immediate agreement. But desperate men rarely calculate their odds accurately in the moment they choose to act. Richard's honor guard began pushing toward the steps, no longer disguising their intentions, and for a few chaotic seconds the courtyard threatened to descend into the kind of violence that would have overshadowed the announcement entirely. Daniel reached Richard before the guards could close the distance, grabbing his arm and speaking low enough that only those closest could hear what he said next. He told Richard that he recognized two of the men standing in his honor guard from the eastern stables 3 nights earlier, and that Thomas Weller, a palace guard with 11 years of unblemished service, was prepared to testify under oath about the poison they had discussed preparing for Sarah's evening meal. Richard's composure finally broke. He understood that any further move toward violence in front of the entire capital would only confirm exactly what Daniel was accusing him of, and that his best remaining option was retreat rather than exposure. The king, watching from the steps, ordered his guards to escort Richard Holloway and his men out of the capital under close watch, making clear that any further attempt to interfere with the succession would be treated as an act of open rebellion against the crown. The crowd, having witnessed the confrontation unfold in real time, seemed to shift almost immediately in Sarah's favor, several nobles kneeling on the courtyard stones as a gesture of acceptance that spread through the gathering like something contagious. Sarah stood frozen for a long moment, watching people she had never met bow toward a version of herself she was still learning to recognize, before James stepped up beside her and quietly reminded her to breathe. In the weeks that followed, Sarah began the slow process of learning what her new position actually required of her, spending mornings with advisors who tried to explain trade agreements and afternoons with historians who filled in the 21 years of her life the palace had erased. James struggled more than he expected to with the transition, uncertain how a farmer fit into a life surrounded by nobles and formal titles, though Sarah made clear early on that she had no intention of building a life that did not include him exactly as he was. Daniel was offered a formal position within the palace guard, an offer he accepted only after negotiating for authority over training new recruits in the very tunnels he had once been forced to dig as a prisoner, determined that no future king would ever again use them to hide people the way he and his wife had once been hidden. The king, for his part, spent the following months trying to earn back trust he had spent 2 decades losing, starting with a formal apology delivered privately to Daniel for the years he had spent underground, and continuing with a review of the very law that had once given soldiers the right to take wives and daughters from their homes without consequence. Sarah insisted on being present for every meeting where that law was discussed, telling the council plainly that she understood better than any of them what it felt like to have her entire life rearranged by a single line written into old parchment. Within a year, the law was formally repealed, though Sarah often said privately to James that no piece of parchment could undo what it had already cost families across the kingdom for generations before her. On the first anniversary of the day, soldiers broke down their front door. Sarah asked James to walk with her back to the farm they had once shared, insisting on making the journey without a royal escort of any kind. The old house still stood, weathered and quiet, the axe James had dropped that morning still resting where it had fallen beside the woodpile. Sarah picked it up and set it against the wall of the house they no longer lived in, saying she wanted it kept exactly as it was, a reminder of the life that had existed before everything changed, and the life that had somehow grown out of its wreckage. James asked if she ever regretted what the mark on her wrist had cost them. Sarah told him the mark had never cost her anything. It had only ever revealed what had already been true. Daniel visited the farm a week later, no longer dressed as a prisoner or a palace guard, but simply as a man who had finally stopped running from his own history. He told Sarah and James that he had begun teaching the youngest recruits in the tunnels, not just how to move through the dark, but why those passages existed in the first place, refusing to let the next generation forget what had been done there, in the name of a king's convenience. Sarah asked him if he had found any peace since the day the truth came out in the courtyard. Daniel considered the question longer than either of them expected before answering. He said peace was not something he had found all at once, but something he noticed slowly, the way morning light changes a room before anyone realizes the sun has actually risen. The kingdom itself changed more slowly than any of them, but it changed. Families who had once lived in fear of a knock at the door began speaking openly about relatives taken decades earlier under the old law, and for the first time, the palace kept records not to control its people, but to help them find each other again. Sarah never stopped being a farmer's daughter even after becoming the kingdom's rightful heir, and she made certain every decree she signed reflected that fact, believing that a crown earned through loss meant nothing if it forgot the people still living the loss she had once known herself. James, watching her sign her name to another new law one evening by candlelight, thought back to the morning he lost her, and understood finally that he had not simply gotten his wife back. He had watched her become exactly who she was always meant to be.